there are moments that change everything. For me, it was the sight of two men on my porch, dressed in tactical black uniforms with crisp, official-looking patches. They carried themselves with an air of absolute authority, and they were here to arrest me. My supposed crime, according to the HOA president standing smugly behind them, was a violation of Aesthetic Guideline 7B. They produced a pair of shiny handcuffs, their movements practiced and intimidating. They truly believed they had all the power. They believed their word was law. But they made one critical miscalculation. They had no idea who they were dealing with, or what was in the locked briefcase in my home office. How could they know their little power trip was about to intersect with a real federal investigation? My line of work is complicated. It involves long hours, high stakes, and a level of stress that seeps into your bones. I spend my days navigating the worst parts of human nature, dealing with situations where the lines between right and wrong are often blurred and violently crossed. So, when it came time to buy a house, I was looking for the complete opposite of my professional life. I was searching for boring. I craved predictability. I wanted a place so meticulously planned and uneventful that it would feel like living in a different reality altogether. That's what led me to the summit at Maple Creek. From the brochure, it was a suburban paradise, a master-planned community where every lawn was a perfect shade of green, every house a tasteful variant of beige, and every street curved gently into another, creating a peaceful, self-contained world. It was a fortress of tranquility, shielded from the chaos I dealt with on a daily basis. Anonymity was the greatest luxury I could afford, and Maple Creek seemed to offer it in spades. I wanted to be just another face, another quiet homeowner who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and put his recycling out on Tuesdays. A place to decompress, to switch off the part of my brain that was always analyzing, always searching for threats. A place where the biggest drama might be a neighbor's dog barking a little too late at night. It seemed perfect. The day I moved in, I was handed a welcome packet by the real estate agent. It contained a bottle of sparkling cider, some coupons for local pizzerias, and a leather-bound binder that weighed about 5 pounds. This, she explained with a cheerful smile, was the community Bible, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Maple Creek Homeowners Association. I flipped through it briefly. In my job, I've read investigative dossiers thicker than this, filled with dense legal jargon and convoluted timelines. This binder, with its oddly specific rules about mailbox designs, approved paint swatches, and the maximum allowable height for garden gnomes, seemed almost quaint by comparison. I tossed it on the counter, assuming it was just standard procedure for a community that valued its property values. I had severely underestimated the document, and the woman who wielded it as her personal scepter. Her name was Carol, and she introduced herself on my second day. I was in the front yard, wrestling a flat-pack bookshelf out of my car, when she marched across her immaculate lawn with the purposeful stride of a drill sergeant. She was in her late 50s, with a perfectly sculpted helmet of blonde hair and eyes that seemed to be conducting a forensic scan of my entire property. She offered a smile that didn't quite reach them and introduced herself as the president of the HOA. Her welcome was a thinly veiled orientation, a verbal tour of the neighborhood's most common infractions. She pointed out a neighbor's basketball hoop that wasn't stored correctly, noted that my moving truck had been parked on the street for 2 hours longer than the bylaws allowed, and gave me a friendly reminder that all trash cans must be completely out of sight from the street by 7 p.m. on collection day. I just nodded and thanked her, eager to get back to my unpacking. But I noticed something in that first meeting. The way she spoke wasn't as a representative of the community, but as its absolute ruler. This wasn't her neighborhood, it was her kingdom. Over the next few weeks, I began to see the subtle machinery of her reign. Neighbors would fall silent when she walked by. Lawn care services would work with a frantic energy on her street. And then there was her personal security force. I first saw them a month after I moved in. 2 men, both a little too old to be playing soldier, were patrolling the sidewalks in matching navy blue polo shirts with a stitched logo that read Community Enforcement. At first, I thought they were just an overzealous neighborhood watch. They didn't carry weapons, but they walked with an air of self-importance, carrying clipboards and occasionally stopping to measure the distance between a hedge and the sidewalk with a tape measure. It was bizarre, a kind of live-action roleplay of authority that I found more amusing than threatening. My job had given me a very clear understanding of what real authority looked like, and this wasn't it. This was a parody, a game of make-believe for adults who craved power. I dismissed them and their queen as a harmless suburban quirk. That was my second mistake. The conflict, when it finally began, started with a simple, practical decision. The standard-issue mailbox in Maple Creek was a flimsy, decorative thing made of thin metal. It offered zero security. In my line of work, privacy and security are paramount. Even though this was supposed to be my quiet sanctuary, old habits die hard. I ordered a new mailbox, a heavy-duty, reinforced steel model with an anti-pry lock and a slot narrow enough to prevent mail phishing. It wasn't ornate or flashy, it was a simple, black, functional box designed for one purpose: to keep what was inside it safe. The day I installed it, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. It was a minor upgrade, a small step in turning this house into my secure and private home. I finished just as the sun was setting, and as I was cleaning up my tools, I glanced across the street. There, in the window of her perfectly symmetrical house, I could just make out a silhouette. It was Carol. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there watching. And in that moment, I felt the first real chill run down my spine. I hadn't just installed a new mailbox. I had violated a sacred rule. I had disrupted the perfect, uniform landscape of her kingdom, and I had a sinking feeling that her ridiculous, make-believe police force was about to be mobilized. The chill I felt seeing Carol watching me from her window was a premonition. I just didn't realize how quickly the storm would arrive. 3 days later, the first shot was fired, not with a confrontation on my lawn, but with the quiet, clinical precision of bureaucracy. Tucked into the slot of my new secure mailbox was a crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the official crest of the Maple Creek HOA. The tone of the letter inside was a masterclass in passive aggression. It was overly formal, citing bylaw after bylaw, a dense paragraph of legalese that boiled down to one simple fact: my mailbox was an abomination. It was, according to the Architectural Review Committee, a flagrant deviation from the pre-approved community aesthetic. The letter informed me that I had incurred an initial fine of $50 and had 14 days to cure the violation. The cure, of course, was to rip out my secure, functional mailbox and replace it with one of their flimsy, approved models. I almost laughed. After the things I'd seen in my career, the idea of being fined for a mailbox felt like a parody. My professional instincts, however, kicked in. I saw it not as a neighborly dispute, but as a procedural challenge. I was dealing with what I assumed was a system, and systems have rules and processes that can be navigated with logic. I spent an evening drafting a response. I was calm, respectful, and rational. I explained that my choice of mailbox was based on security concerns, a right I felt was reasonable for any homeowner. I even cited U.S. Postal Service guidelines that encourage the use of locking mailboxes to prevent mail theft, a federal crime. I laid out my case with the same methodical care I would use in a professional brief, believing that any reasonable person would see the logic in my position. I enclosed my letter in a stamped envelope, dropped it in the outgoing mail slot of my fortress-like mailbox, and assumed that would be the end of it. I had presented a logical argument to a governing body. I expected a logical outcome. It was becoming clear I was not dealing with a governing body, I was dealing with a tyrant. The response came a week later. It was another cream-colored envelope. My appeal was denied. The letter stated that security concerns do not supersede the established community aesthetic covenants. The Architectural Review Committee, which I was beginning to suspect was just Carol's royal court, had found my reasoning insufficient. Furthermore, since the initial 14-day period had passed, my fine had now doubled to $100, with an additional $10 per day penalty until the violation was cured. The message was clear: logic had no place in Carol's kingdom. This was not a negotiation. It was an edict. And that's when the harassment began in earnest. The psychological campaign started subtly. Carol's Community Enforcement Patrol, the two self-important men in their golf cart, changed their route. Now, their patrol seemed to consist exclusively of the 50-yard stretch of pavement directly in front of my house. They would park across the street, their ridiculous golf cart with its flashing amber light a constant, nagging presence. They would sit there for hours, sipping from large thermal mugs, making a great show of writing on their clipboards whenever I left or entered my home. They never spoke to me. They never set foot on my property. They just watched. It was a classic low-level intimidation tactic, designed to unnerve, to create a constant feeling of being monitored. In my line of work, I was used to conducting surveillance, not being the target of it. The irony was infuriating. Then came the blizzard of paper. My mailbox, the very object of their obsession, became a vessel for their war. Every other day, I would find a new notice, another cream-colored envelope. The infractions became more and more absurd. My lawn, which I had mowed 2 days prior, was apparently a quarter of an inch over the maximum allowable height. A single, barely visible dandelion had sprouted near my driveway. My garden hose was not coiled in a perfectly concentric clockwise spiral, as stipulated in some godforsaken appendix of their rulebook. Each ridiculous violation came with its own $50 fine. Within a month, my supposed debt to the HOA had ballooned to over $700. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, and my sanctuary, the boring, peaceful home I had sought, had become the epicenter of a siege. The amusement I had once felt was long gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. I realized this was no longer about a mailbox. It was a declaration of war. I started my own file. My professional training took over where my patience had failed. I began documenting everything. I set up a discreet security camera in an upstairs window, its lens trained on the street, capturing every minute of the patrols. I photographed every violation notice, saved every letter, and kept a detailed log of the escalating fines. I was no longer just a homeowner, I was an investigator, and Carol was my subject. I was building a case, and I decided it was time to take that case to a higher court, the monthly HOA meeting. I still held a naive belief that public opinion and communal reason might prevail, that if I could just present my evidence to my neighbors, they would see the madness for what it was. The meeting was held in a sterile, beige community clubhouse that smelled of air freshener and quiet desperation. About 15 residents were scattered in folding chairs, a collection of faces I recognized from my street. At the front of the room, seated at a long table like a tribunal, was Carol, flanked by 2 other board members who nodded at her every word like bobbleheads. The atmosphere was thick with a tense, practiced subservience. I quickly realized this wasn't a forum for discussion. It was an audience with the Queen. When the floor was opened for new business, I stood up and calmly presented my case. I spoke about the initial issue with the mailbox, my attempts at a rational appeal, and the subsequent campaign of harassment and frivolous fines. I tried to appeal to our shared sense of reason and fairness. As I spoke, I could feel Carol's eyes burning into me. The other residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between me and the front table, terrified of being caught in the crossfire. When I finished, Carol didn't address any of my points. Instead, she stood up and delivered a chillingly effective performance. She spoke of this sacred duty of the HOA to protect property values, of the slippery slope that begins with one non-compliant mailbox. She painted me as an outsider, a malcontent who refused to embrace the community spirit, someone who thought the rules didn't apply to him. She twisted my desire for security into an act of selfish rebellion. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it worked. By the time she was done, the other residents were avoiding my gaze. I hadn't been seen as a victim. I had been branded a heretic. I left the meeting knowing I had lost, and that I had only made things worse. The very next day, the escalation I had dreaded arrived. Carol's community enforcement officers debuted their new look. The friendly navy blue polo shirts were gone. They had been replaced with black, tactical-style button-downs and cargo pants. The simple logo on their shirts was now an elaborate eagle and shield patch that looked suspiciously like a knockoff government seal. Their golf cart had been adorned with official-looking decals, and they now carried bulky walkie-talkies on their belts, speaking into them with a practiced, serious tone. The pantomime had become dangerously real in their minds. As I watched them march down my sidewalk, their new uniforms glinting in the afternoon sun, I knew this wasn't just a game to her anymore. And it couldn't be one for me either. The final straw came a week later. It was a large, stiff envelope delivered by certified mail, requiring my signature. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm in the city. Inside was a formal multi-page demand letter. It listed every supposed violation, every fine, every late fee, and a host of new creatively invented legal charges. My debt, according to their letterhead, now stood at $4,350. The letter stated in no uncertain terms that if the full amount was not paid and all violations were not cured within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. They were threatening to take my home. My sanctuary. The one place on earth I had chosen to escape the conflict in the darkness. They were threatening to take it all away over a black metal box and a few dandelions. I stood in my kitchen, the lawyer's letter trembling in my hand, and looked out the window. One of the fake officers was standing on the public sidewalk, deliberately staring at my front door, his hand resting on his walkie-talkie as if it were a sidearm. He was playing a part, a fantasy of power and authority given to him by an HOA president on a demented power trip. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The frustration, the anger, the feeling of helplessness. It all solidified into a single, cold point of clarity. I had tried to fight this as a homeowner. I had played by their corrupt, ridiculous rules. I had appealed, I had argued, I had documented. And I had lost at every single turn. I looked at the fake cop playing soldier on my street, and at the legal threat in my hand, and I realized they had left me no other choice. They had pushed me into a corner, and they had no idea who they had cornered. They believed they were the ultimate authority in this manufactured little world. They were about to learn that their world was a very, very small part of a much larger one, a world with real rules, real laws, and real consequences. The game was over. It was time for me to start acting like who I really was. The lawyer's letter was not an endpoint, it was a trigger. For weeks, I had been the target, the nail that stuck up and demanded to be hammered down. I had absorbed every blow, documented every infraction, and endured every act of petty intimidation. But the threat of foreclosure, the attempt to use the color of law to seize my home, changed the very nature of the conflict. This was no longer harassment. It was a criminal conspiracy hiding behind the flimsy shield of an HOA bylaw. Carol and her minions had stopped playing a game and had started committing felonies. And that moved them out of the world of community covenants and squarely into mine. I let the 30-day deadline on the lawyer's letter tick away unanswered. I paid none of the fines. I did not remove the mailbox. My silence, I knew, would be interpreted by Carol as weakness or defiance, either of which would be sufficient to provoke her into making her final, fatal mistake. While she waited for the clock to run out, I went to work. My home office, once a sanctuary for decompression, transformed into a command center. The case file I had started on Carol grew thicker. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was the lead investigator on a case of one. Using only publicly available records and subscription databases that any citizen can access, I painted a detailed picture of my adversaries. Carol, it turned out, had a history of litigation, a trail of small claims court battles against contractors, gardeners, and even a former friend over a trivial debt. She was a petty tyrant long before she was crowned president of the HOA. Her officers, Gary and Mike, were exactly who I expected them to be. Men with failed aspirations, one a former security guard fired for overzealousness, the other a man who had failed the police academy entrance exam 3 times. They weren't just playing a part, they were living a fantasy that Carol had made real for them. The final piece of my preparation was a single, carefully worded phone call to an old friend, a detective with the local police department. I didn't ask for any favors. I didn't flash my credentials. I simply spoke as a concerned citizen. I told him I had evidence of individuals in my neighborhood impersonating law enforcement officers, and that I had reason to believe they were using this false authority to extort money and intimidate residents. I forwarded him a summary of my case file, the photos, the video logs, the litany of fraudulent fines. I told him I believed the situation was likely to escalate on a specific date. He was a good cop and he knew what I was really telling him. He promised to have a patrol car in the area. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the apex predator of Maple Creek to walk into it. The day after the deadline expired was a Saturday. The morning was bright and clear, the picture of suburban tranquility. At precisely 10 a.m. it began. A loud, authoritative banging rattled my front door. Not a knock but a summons. I looked through the peephole. It was Gary and Mike, standing shoulder to shoulder in their full tactical regalia, their hands hovering near their belts. And behind them on my walkway stood Queen Carol, her arms crossed, her face a mask of smug, righteous fury. This was it. The moment she had been building towards. Her final victory. I opened the door. I didn't speak. I just stood there, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. This unnerved them. They were expecting fear or anger. They got nothing. "Sir," Gary began, puffing out his chest, his voice an octave lower than usual as he tried to sound official. "You have failed to comply with a legal notice of eviction." Carol stepped forward, cutting him off. "That's not right, Gary, be specific," she snapped, then turned her venomous gaze on me. "We are here to perform a citizen's arrest," she declared, the words tasting like triumph in her mouth. "For the willful destruction of community property and your criminal refusal to pay legally assessed fines." It was the most absurd, delusional, and wildly illegal statement I had ever heard. They were going to arrest me. On my own property. For a mailbox. Gary, emboldened by his queen, produced a pair of shiny, real-looking handcuffs. "You need to come with us now," he said, taking a step forward and reaching for my arm. The air grew still. This was the precipice. The peak of their madness. I didn't move an inch. I just looked at his outstretched hand and then back to his face. "I wouldn't do that," I said, my voice quiet, calm, but carrying a weight that made him freeze. Slowly, deliberately, I reached inside my jacket. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of panic in their eyes. They had no idea what to expect. I pulled out my wallet. I didn't flash it. I opened it with a steady hand, turned it so the morning sun glinted off the golden shield, and held it up for them to see. Special Agent, I said, letting each word land with the force of a hammer blow. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging their entire fantasy world into a cold, dark reality. The color drained from Carol's face, leaving a pasty, slack-jawed mask of horror. Gary and Mike exchanged a wide-eyed, panicked look, the cheap fabric of their fake uniforms suddenly looking like what it was, a costume. The handcuffs in Gary's hand seemed to become impossibly heavy, and he let them fall to his side with a quiet clatter. "You can't, you're not." Carol stammered, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. "Oh, I am," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. "And you have made so many mistakes. Let's list them, shall we?" I took a step forward and they all involuntarily took a step back. "Let's start with impersonating a law enforcement officer. That's a felony. Then there's attempted unlawful detainment. Also a felony. We can add extortion under the color of law, which is the act of using false authority to demand money, which you've been doing for months. And since you used the United States Postal Service to deliver those fraudulent demands, you've committed mail fraud. That's a federal offense." I gestured to the small, discreet camera in my window. "Every word you've said, every threat you've made has been recorded. The case file is extensive." Carol's composure finally shattered. "This is an HOA matter," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You have no authority here. This is private property. You made it a public matter the moment you decided to break state and federal laws," I said, my voice like ice. "But you are right about one thing. In this specific situation, I don't have the authority to arrest you." I paused, letting that small glimmer of hope register in her terrified eyes before I extinguished it completely. "But they do." As if on cue, 2 marked police cruisers from the local department turned onto our street, their movements calm and deliberate. They didn't use their sirens. They didn't need to. They pulled up to the curb and 2 uniformed, armed and very real police officers got out. They saw the scene on my porch, me standing in my doorway and the 3 costumed figures who looked like they had seen a ghost, and they understood immediately. Carol, Gary, and Mike stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of the very authority they had so pathetically tried to imitate. Their little kingdom, with its imaginary laws and toy soldiers, was being invaded by the real world. The real law was walking up my driveway. Carol had spent months trying to take my home. She had built an empire of fear on a foundation of petty rules and a fake police force. Now, as the real police officers stepped onto her perfectly manicured lawn, her empire was about to come crashing down. And I was going to have a front row seat to watch it burn. The arrival of the real police was like a splash of ice water on a fever dream. The world of make-believe that Carol had so meticulously constructed evaporated in the harsh glare of reality. Her 2 officers, Gary and Mike, seemed to physically shrink inside their tactical costumes. The walkie-talkies on their belts suddenly looked like children's toys, and the stern expressions they had practiced in the mirror melted into pure, unadulterated panic. They were no longer enforcers. They were 2 middle-aged men in silly outfits who were in a world of trouble. Carol, however, clung to her delusion for a few moments longer. As the first officer approached my porch, his hand resting calmly on his duty belt, she actually tried to pull rank. "Officer," she said, her voice a strained, wavering imitation of authority. "I am the president of this homeowners association. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at me, "is in violation of community covenants, and we are performing a lawful citizen's arrest." The police officer gave her a long, tired look, the kind a professional reserves for someone who is profoundly disconnected from reality. He glanced at the FBI credentials still in my hand, then at the ridiculous eagle and shield patches on Gary's shirt, and a look of weary understanding crossed his face. He had seen this kind of thing before. The little tyrants of cul-de-sacs, the petty dictators of suburbia. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and professional, "why don't you tell me why your associates are dressed like they're about to raid a warehouse?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Gary and Mike. "I need to see some identification from you 2. And I'd advise you to lose the costumes." That was the final blow. The fantasy was officially over. As the officers separated the 3 of them for questioning, the neighborhood began to awaken. Curtains twitched. Doors cracked open. The residents of Maple Creek, who had lived under Carol's thumb for years, emerged to witness the downfall of her regime. They saw the fake police being questioned by real police. They saw Carol, no longer a queen surveying her kingdom, but a flustered, frantic woman trying to explain her actions to men who were not impressed by her title. My role in the immediate drama was over. I gave my statement, provided the lead officer with a copy of my case file, and then I went back inside my house, leaving the law to take its course. From my window, I watched as Gary and Mike were formally arrested, cuffed, with real handcuffs this time, and placed in the back of a patrol car. Carol wasn't arrested on the spot, but as she was handed a summons and read her rights, her face crumbled. The mask of power was gone, replaced by the stark, terrified realization that she was no longer in charge. The legal fallout was swift and devastating for them. The local prosecutor filed charges of impersonating a public servant and attempted extortion. My file, with its meticulous documentation, made the case an easy one. But it was the mail fraud that sealed their fate. As I had predicted, using the U.S. mail to transmit fraudulent financial demands is a federal crime, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service does not take such matters lightly. Once their investigators got involved, Carol's entire operation was laid bare. They uncovered a pattern of intimidation and financial abuse that went back years. Dozens of other residents, emboldened by Carol's fall from grace, came forward with their own stories of absurd fines and harassment. The case against her was no longer just about my mailbox, it was about a systemic abuse of power. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of federal prison time, all three took plea deals. Gary and Mike, the toy soldiers, got off with felony probation, hefty fines, and court-ordered psychological counseling. Their days of playing cops were over for good. Carol, as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence. She avoided jail time, but was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, was forced to pay restitution to every resident she had fraudulently fined, and was permanently barred from ever serving on any board or committee of any kind, anywhere. Her reign was officially and legally over. The impact on the community was transformative. An emergency HOA meeting was called, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of liberation. The 2 bobblehead board members who had been Carol's loyal cronies resigned in disgrace. A new board was elected that very night, comprised of residents who believed an HOA's purpose was to maintain the community, not to police it. One of the first motions they passed was the Mailbox Freedom Act, a tongue-in-cheek tribute to the catalyst of their revolution. All of Carol's ridiculous, petty rules were systematically dismantled. Her community enforcement division was officially and permanently dissolved. The entire 5-pound binder of rules was rewritten from scratch, reduced to a few common-sense pages about basic upkeep. The reign of terror was over. For me, the resolution was quieter but no less profound. The lien on my property was, of course, immediately voided, and the HOA's law firm sent me a formal letter of apology. The thousands of dollars in fake fines vanished as if they had never existed. My secure, black mailbox remained where it was, a silent monument to the absurdity. It became something of a local landmark. New residents were told the story of the HOA president who tried to arrest an FBI agent and ended up facing federal charges herself. But the greatest victory was the return of the very thing I had come to Maple Creek to find: boring, beautiful, peaceful anonymity. The patrols were gone. The constant feeling of being watched vanished. My neighbors, no longer afraid to associate with the neighborhood heretic, began to wave. We chat while taking out the trash. I was no longer an outsider, I was just another homeowner. I had my sanctuary back. The irony was that in order to find peace, I had to go to war. I had to bring the conflict and the chaos of my professional life into the heart of my quiet home. But by doing so, I had not only secured my own peace, but the peace of an entire community. Power is a strange thing. On a grand scale, it can shape nations and change the course of history. But on a small scale, in a quiet suburban street, it can be just as corrupting, just as toxic. Carol was not a world leader, she was just a woman with a title and a binder full of rules. But she had the power to make people's lives miserable, to turn a neighborhood into a place of anxiety and fear. She forgot that the authority of a community is granted by the people, and it must be wielded for their benefit, not for the aggrandizement of one person's ego. She built her kingdom on a foundation of paper-thin rules and imaginary authority, and it took only a small dose of reality to bring the entire pathetic structure crashing down. How many other little kingdoms like this exist, hiding in plain sight on quiet, tree-lined streets?